Are you a landscape photographer looking to get into wildlife photography? Or maybe a beginner wildlife photographer just doing some research? Though there are many things in common between landscape photography and wildlife photography, there are some major differences to consider. Let's discuss some of the composition, exposure, and gear differences when photographing wildlife versus landscapes for you to consider. I think it's natural for landscape photographers to also photograph wildlife. I also think that photographing wildlife will enhance your landscape photography skills and vice versa. I had spent a couple years only photographing landscapes before I started photographing birds and other wildlife. My first few attempts were humbling as I had a lot to learn. I watched a lot of online videos, talked to a lot of wildlife photographers, and practice. So let's go through some of my findings to help you transition into wildlife photography or help you begin your new wildlife photography journey. I teach that nature photography has three key elements: art, nature, and technology. I'll use that template for discussing landscape photography versus wildlife photography. When composing a landscape photograph, we're usually photographing a scene that has many elements in the foreground, the midground, and the background. The default is to look for a tack-sharp image from front to back with everything in focus. There are typically guidelines for the composition of landscapes: rule of third, balance, eliminate distractions, and so on. And shooting landscapes allow more time in setting up these compositions. Usually the landscape is static unless there's moving water or perhaps clouds that you want to photograph with your personal artistic impression. When composing wildlife, you usually have a single dynamic subject to be composed within a scene. Eliminating all distractions as much as possible in the composition is usually desired. Minimal foregrounds and backgrounds are visually appealing, and getting those compositions can be very challenging. Unless going for an environmental photo where you want to include the environment that the subject is in. Compositions usually have the subject at eye level with the photographer. Also, shooting wildlife is much more dynamic once the subject is found. You must position yourself quickly to get the best composition, or even better, pre-position in anticipation of where that wildlife is going. A tack-sharp image and focus on the eye is usually ideal, and artistic interpretation will come in if you want some motion blur, perhaps in the wings of a bird in flight or the body of an animal in motion. Environmental compositions are up to your interpretation, showing the subject in focus with the environment sharp or for reference. For example, an osprey with a fish, a bear with a salmon, and a bird in flight versus posing stationary. For wildlife, you will be composing in real time or as your field craft improves, looking at compositions and maneuvering to get them with a dynamic subject. When exposing a landscape image, typically you're using a smaller aperture, while shutter speed is not as important unless you're going for some sense of motion, such as a waterfall or moving clouds. Though if windy conditions are present, you may want a faster shutter speed to keep the foliage sharp. At the same time, trying to keep ISO at or close to base unless increasing it is to allow a faster shutter speed as desired during certain conditions. For wildlife, typically our aperture is wide open or near wide open for two main reasons. We're shooting at a faster shutter speed and a desire to blur the foreground and background. You'll want to keep the eye of the subject in focus and sharp. The sharpness of the rest of the animal is up to artistic considerations as mentioned before. The rest of the image should not distract from the subject. Shutter speed depends on subject, such as a fast bird in flight versus a turtle on a log. In general, the shutter speed for wildlife is much higher than it is for landscapes. Because of this, you must be aware of ISO. Many times it will be high. I use auto ISO in manual mode, and you always have the option of noise reduction. Understanding nature for landscape photography, such as geology, botany, etc., is helpful. The understanding can influence what you photograph and how you photograph for landscapes. Unique trees to an area, unique formations, waterfalls are examples of the subjects that we photograph in landscapes, and the better knowledge we have of the nature in that area, again, will drive what we typically photograph. Understanding animal behavior and the nature of animals for wildlife photography is even more important, and some would say even required. The knowledge of migration patterns of birds, hunting behavior of a bear, and flight patterns of a bird are crucial to consistently being able to photograph the wildlife of your choice. Though sometimes you do get lucky. In the beginning, you'll get a lot of record shots or identification shots, but to progress, you'll need to improve your knowledge of the animal as well as your field crafting to be able to get that image. And it's not unusual to spend days, months, or even years trying to get an image of a species that you really like. Considering location for landscape photography, the good thing about it is when you're going to your subject, there it is. Of course, you'll have variables such as the weather conditions and the time of year, the time of day, that will influence how you photograph that. Traveling to unique locations will improve your skills as you photograph more and more unique scenes. Considering location for wildlife, when you go to the area that your subject lives, maybe it is there, maybe it isn't. And then you have to know when and where to find it. If it is there, it'll likely move. So fieldcraft is much more critical for wildlife. How will that species move? Where will it go next? And how will it react when I'm there to photograph it? All those things need to be considered and improved on to get better and better wildlife photography. And then for both, you have to consider the ethics, leave no trace, and do not stress the wildlife. Because of the artistic expressions that you will want with each, the natural aspects of a stationary landscape versus dynamic wildlife, the equipment needs will be different. For example, when considering lenses, the focal length of a landscape photograph typically anywhere from 20 millimeters, let's say up to 400 millimeters. Wildlife is usually a telephoto 200 to 600, 100 to 400 is common as well, and beyond, though environmental compositions may benefit from a wider angle. These lenses must also be able to focus quickly for wildlife, not as important for landscapes, obviously. And having a quote-unquote fast lens or wider aperture is more helpful for wildlife than it is for landscape. When thinking about your camera's autofocus, for landscape it isn't even critical, especially the focus speed. Of course, accurate focus is critical, where to focus is critical, but manual focus is often used. So in general, your camera's autofocus capability isn't nearly as important for landscape as it is for wildlife. For wildlife, you must have fast, reliable, and accurate autofocus. Multiple focus options are valuable, such as tracking and focus area, and being able to choose those and select those quickly. Wildlife rarely sits still and gives you time to manual focus. Occasionally they do, but don't depend on it. Knowing how to use and modify your camera's autofocus quickly is critical for wildlife. Frame rates for wildlife is critical. We typically want something at 20 frames per second as being reasonable. Up to 30 frames per second is great to have as well. Why? Well, simply animals move. And even when they're stationary, their expressions change or their behaviors change or their actions are changing. And you'll want to capture multiple images when that opportunity is there. And obviously, for landscape photography, frame rate isn't even of a concern. High resolution is helpful for both, and we always want to get the highest resolution we can, other than considerations of file size and storage. And don't forget, with wildlife, you'll likely be cropping a lot more than you do in landscape. When talking about other gear for wildlife versus landscape photography, a quality tripod is helpful for both. Though with wildlife, you'll possibly shoot more. Now, you definitely will shoot more handheld because of convenience. On the tripod, typically using a ball head or something similar for landscape photography. I don't like ball heads, so I'm using an Acrotect LLH. And then for wildlife, you're typically shooting handheld or with a gimbal or fluid head, though you don't always have time to set up a tripod when photographing wildlife. A monopod can be helpful to have. I have both for wildlife. And as I mentioned, for the tripod, typically have a gimbal head or fluid head, since the ball head is just not sufficient for most wildlife setups, and it's just inconvenient to use as well for wildlife. So that's a somewhat brief overview of wildlife versus landscape photography. I hope this helps any landscape photographers getting into wildlife photography or anyone starting wildlife photography. If you'd like me to expand on any of the topics, please leave a comment. And whether you're a landscape photographer or a nature photographer, enjoy the outdoors responsibly.